Section 11 of Hans Christian Andersen's Fairy Tales and Short Stories, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hans Christian Andersen, Fairy Tales and Short Stories, Volume 1, 1835 to 1842, by Hans Christian Andersen, translated by H.P. Paul. The Goloshes of Fortune, Part 1, by Hans Christian Andersen, 1838. A Beginning. In a house in Copenhagen, not far from the King's New Market, a very large party had assembled, the host and his family expecting no doubt to receive invitations in return. One half of the company were already seated at the card tables. The other half seemed to be waiting the result of their hostess's question, "Well, how shall we amuse ourselves?" Conversation followed, which after a while began to prove very entertaining. Among other subjects it turned upon the events of the Middle Ages, which some persons maintained were more full of interest than our own times. Councillor Knapp defended this opinion so warmly that the lady of the house immediately went over to his side, and both exclaimed against Orsted's essays on ancient and modern times, in which the preference is given to our own. The councillor considered the times of the Danish king, Hans, as the noblest and happiest. He died in 1513. He married Christine, daughter of the Electoral Prince Ernest of Saxony. The conversation on this topic was only interrupted for a moment by the arrival of a newspaper, which did not, however, contain much worth reading, and while it was still going on, we will pay a visit to the ante-room, in which cloaks, sticks, and goloshes were carefully placed. Here sat two maidens, one young and the other old, as if they had come and were waiting to accompany their mistress home. But on looking at them more closely, it could easily be seen that they were no common servants. Their shapes were too graceful, their complexions too delicate, and the cut of their dresses much too elegant. They were two fairies. The younger was not Fortune herself, but the chambermaid of one of Fortune's attendants, who carries about her more trifling gifts. The elder one, who was named Care, looked rather gloomy. She always goes about to perform her own business in person, for then she knows it is properly done. They were telling each other where they had been during the day. The messenger of Fortune had only transacted a few unimportant matters. For instance, she had preserved a new bonnet from a shower of rain, and obtained for an honest man a bow from a titled nobody, and so on. But she had something extraordinary to relate after all. "I must tell you," said she, "that to-day is my birthday, and in honor of it I have been entrusted with a pair of goloshes to introduce amongst mankind. These goloshes have the property of making every one who puts them on imagine himself in any place he wishes, or that he exists at any period. Every wish is fulfilled at the moment it is expressed, so that for once mankind have the chance of being happy." "No," replied Care, "you may depend upon it that whoever puts on those goloshes will be very unhappy, and bless the moment in which he can get rid of them." "What are you thinking of?" replied the other. "Now see, I will place them by the door. Some one will take them instead of his own, and he will be the happy man." This was the end of their conversation. What happened to the councillor? It was late when Councillor Knapp, lost in thought about the times of King Hans, desired to return home, and fate so ordered it that he put on the goloshes of Fortune instead of his own, and walked out into the East Street. Through the magic power of the goloshes he was at once carried back 300 years to the time of King Hans, for which he had been longing when he put them on. Therefore he immediately set his foot into the mud and mire of the street, which in those days possessed no pavement. "Why, this is horrible! How dreadfully dirty it is!" said the councillor. and the whole pavement has vanished, and the lamps are all out." The moon had not yet risen high enough to penetrate the thick foggy air, and all the objects around him were confused together in the darkness. At the nearest corner a lamp hung before a picture of the Madonna, but the light it gave was almost useless, for he only perceived it when he came quite close, and his eyes fell on the painted figures of the mother and child. "That is most likely a museum of art," thought he, "and they have forgotten to take down the sign." Two men in the dress of olden times passed by him. "What odd figures," thought he, "they must be returning from some masquerade." Suddenly he heard the sound of a drum and fifes, and then a blazing light from torches shone upon him. The counsellor stared with astonishment as he beheld a most strange procession pass before him. First came a whole troop of drummers, beating their drums very cleverly. They were followed by life guards with long bows and crossbows. The principal person in the procession was a clerical-looking gentleman, and the astonished counsellor asked what it all meant, and who the gentleman might be. "Why, that is the Bishop of Zealand." "Good gracious!" he exclaimed, "what in the world has happened to the bishop? What can he be thinking about?" Then he shook his head and said, "It cannot possibly be the bishop himself." While musing on this strange affair, and without looking to the right or left, he walked on through East Street and over High Bridge Place. The bridge, which he supposed led to Palace Square, was nowhere to be found, but instead he saw a bank and some shallow water, and two people who sat in a boat. "Does the gentleman wish to be ferried over the Holme?" asked one. "To the Holme!" exclaimed the counsellor, not knowing in what age he was now existing. "I want to go to Christian's Haven in Little Turf Street." The men stared at him. "Pray tell me where the bridge is," said he. "It's a shameful thing that the lamps are not lighted here, and it is as muddy as if one were walking in a marsh." But the more he talked with the boatman, the less they could understand each other. "I don't understand your outlandish talk," he cried at last, angrily turning his back upon them. He could not, however, find the bridge, nor any railings. "What a scandalous condition this place is in," said he. Never, certainly, had he found his own times so miserable as on this evening. "I think it will be better for me to take a coach. But where are they?" There was not one to be seen. "I shall be obliged to go back to the King's New Market," said he, "where there are plenty of carriages standing, or I shall never reach Christian's Haven." Then he went towards East Street, and had nearly passed through it, when the moon burst forth from a cloud. "Dear me, what have they been erecting here?" he cried, as he caught sight of Eastgate, which in olden times used to stand at the end of East Street. However, he found an opening through which he passed, and came out upon where he expected to find the New Market. Nothing was to be seen but an open meadow, surrounded by a few bushes, through which ran a broad canal or stream. A few miserable-looking wooden booths, for the accommodation of Dutch watermen, stood on the opposite shore. "Either I behold a Fata Morgana, or I must be tipsy," groaned the counsellor. "What can it be? What is the matter with me?" He turned back in the full conviction that he must be ill. In walking through the street this time, he examined the houses more closely. He found that most of them were built of lath and plaster, and many had only a thatched roof. "I am certainly all wrong," said he with a sigh, "and yet I only drank one glass of punch. But I cannot bear even that, and it was very foolish to give us punch and hot salmon. I shall speak about it to our hostess, the agent's lady. Suppose I were to go back now and say how ill I feel. I fear it would look so ridiculous, and it is not very likely that I should find anyone up." Then he looked for the house, but it was not in existence. "Now this is really frightful. I cannot even recognize East Street. Not a shop to be seen, nothing but old wretched tumble-down houses, just as if I were at Roxkild or Ringstead. Oh, I really must be ill. It is no use to stand upon ceremony, but where in the world is the agent's house? There is a house, but it is not his, and people still up in it. I can hear. Oh dear, I certainly am very queer." As he reached the half-open door, he saw a light and went in. It was a tavern of the olden times, and seemed a kind of beer shop. The room had the appearance of a Dutch interior. A number of people, consisting of seamen, Copenhagen citizens, and a few scholars, sat in deep conversation over their mugs, and took very little notice of the newcomer. "Pardon me," said the counsellor, addressing the landlady, I do not feel quite well, and I should be much obliged if you will send for a fly to take me to Christianshavn." The woman stared at him and shook her head, and then she spoke to him in German. The counsellor supposed from this that she did not understand Danish. He therefore repeated his request in German. This, as well as his singular dress, convinced the woman that he was a foreigner. She soon understood, however, that he did not find himself quite well, and therefore brought him a mug of water. It had something of the taste of sea water, certainly, although it had been drawn from the well outside. And then the counsellor leaned his head on his hand, drew a deep breath, and pondered over all the strange things that had happened to him. "Is that today's number of the Day?" which was an evening paper in Copenhagen, he asked quite mechanically, as he saw the woman putting by a large piece of paper. She did not understand what he meant, but she handed him the sheet. It was a woodcut representing a meteor which had appeared in the town of Cologne. "That is very old," said the counsellor, becoming quite cheerful at the sight of this antique drawing. "Where did you get this singular sheet? It is very interesting, although the whole affair is a fable. Meteors are easily explained in these days. They are northern lights, which are often seen, and are no doubt caused by electricity." Those who sat near him and heard what he said looked at him in great astonishment, and one of them rose, took off his hat respectfully, and said in a very serious manner, "You must certainly be a very learned man, monsieur." "Oh no," replied the counsellor, "I can only discourse on topics which every one should understand." "Modestia is a beautiful virtue," said the man. "Moreover, I must add to your speech, mihi secus veditur, yet in this case I would suspend my judicium. May I ask to whom I have the pleasure of speaking?" "I am a bachelor of divinity," said the man. This answer satisfied the counsellor. The title agreed with the dress. "This is surely," thought he, "an old village schoolmaster, a perfect original, such as one meets with sometimes even in Jutland." "This is not certainly a locus docendi," began the man. "Still, I must beg you to continue the conversation. You must be well read in ancient lore." "Oh yes," replied the counsellor, "I am very fond of reading useful old books and modern ones as well, with the exception of everyday stories, of which we really have more than enough." "Everyday stories?" asked the bachelor. "Yes, I mean the new novels that we have at the present day." "Oh," replied the man with a smile, "and yet they are very witty, and are much read at court. The king likes especially the romance of Messrs. Ephon and Gaudian, which describes King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. He has joked about it with the gentlemen of his court." "Well, I have certainly not read that," replied the counsellor. "I suppose it is quite new, and published by Heiberg." "No," answered the man, "it is not by Heiberg. Godfred von Gehmen brought it out." "Oh, is he the publisher? That is a very old name," said the counsellor. "Was it not the name of the first publisher in Denmark?" "Yes, and he is our first printer and publisher now," replied the scholar. So far all had passed off very well, but now one of the citizens began to speak of a terrible pestilence which had been raging a few years before, meaning the plague of 1484. The counsellor thought he referred to the war in 1490, and was spoken of as quite recent. The English pirates had taken some ships in the Channel in 1801, and the counsellor, supposing they referred to these, agreed with them in finding fault with the English. The rest of the talk, however, was not so agreeable. Every moment one contradicted the other. The good bachelor appeared very ignorant, for the simplest remark of the counsellor seemed to him either too bold or too fantastic. They stared at each other, and when it became worse, the bachelor spoke in Latin in the hope of being better understood, but it was all useless. "How are you now?" asked the landlady, pulling the counsellor's sleeve. Then his recollection returned to him. In the course of conversation he had forgotten all that had happened previously. "Goodness me, where am I?" said he. It bewildered him as he thought of it. "We will have some claret, or mead, or Bremen beer," said one of the guests. "Will you drink with us?" Two maids came in. One of them had a cap on her head of two colours. In the time of King Hans, chambermaids were obliged to wear caps of two colours. They poured out the wine, bowed their heads, and withdrew. The counsellor felt a cold shiver run all over him. "What is this? What does it mean?" said he. But he was obliged to drink with them, for they overpowered the good man with their politeness. He became at last desperate, and when one of them said he was tipsy, he did not doubt the man's word in the least, only begged them to get a droshky, and then they thought he was speaking the Muscovite language. Never before had he been in such rough and vulgar company. "One might believe that the country was going back to heathenism," he observed. "This is the most terrible moment of my life." Just then it came into his mind that he would stoop under the table and so creep to the door. He tried it, but before he reached the entry the rest discovered what he was about, and seized him by the feet, when, luckily for him, off came the goloshes, and with them vanished the whole enchantment. The counsellor now saw quite plainly a lamp and a large building behind it. Everything looked familiar and beautiful. He was in East Street, as it now appears. He lay with his legs turned towards a porch, and just by him sat the watchman asleep. "Is it possible that I have been lying here in the street dreaming?" said he. "Yes, this is East Street. How beautifully bright and gay it looks! It is quite shocking that one glass of punch should have upset me like this." 2 minutes afterwards he sat in a droshky, which was to drive him to Christian's Haven. He thought of all the terror and anxiety which he had undergone, and he felt thankful from his heart for the reality and comfort of modern times, which, for all their errors, were far better than those in which he so lately found himself. The Watchman's Adventures. "Well, I declare, there lies a pair of goloshes," said the watchman. "No doubt they belong to the lieutenant who lives upstairs. They are lying just by his door." Gladly would the honest man have rung and given them in, for a light was still burning, but he did not wish to disturb the other people in the house, so he let them lie. "These things must keep the feet very warm," said he. "They are of such nice soft leather." And then he tried them on, and they fitted his feet exactly. "Now," said he, "how droll things are in this world! There's that man can lie down in his warm bed, but he does not do so. There he goes pacing up and down the room. He ought to be a happy man. He has neither wife nor children, and he goes out into company every evening. Oh, I wish I were he. Then I should be a happy man." As he uttered this wish, the goloshes which he had put on took effect, and the watchman at once became the lieutenant. And there he stood in his room, holding a little piece of pink paper between his fingers, on which was a poem written by the lieutenant himself. Who has not had, for once in his life, a moment of poetic inspiration? And at such a moment, if the thoughts are written down, they flow in poetry. The following verses were written on the pink paper: "Oh, were I rich! Oh, were I rich! How oft in youth's bright hour, when youthful pleasures banish every care, I longed for riches but to gain a power, the sword and plume and uniform to wear. The riches and the honor came for me, yet still my greatest wealth was poverty. Ah, help and pity me! Once in my youthful hours, when gay and free, a maiden loved me, and her gentle kiss, rich in its tender love and purity, taught me, alas, too much of earthly bliss. Dear child, she only thought of youthful glee. She loved no wealth, but fairy tales and me. Thou knowest, ah, pity me! Oh, were I rich! Again is all my prayer. That child is now a woman, fair and free, as good and beautiful as angels are. Oh, were I rich in lovers' poetry, to tell my fairy tale, love's richest lore! But no, I must be silent. I am poor. Ah, wilt thou pity me? Oh, were I rich in truth and peace below, I need not then my poverty bewail. To thee I dedicate these lines of woe. Wilt thou not understand the mournful tale? A leaf on which my sorrows I relate, dark story of a darkened night of fate. Ah, bless and pity me. Well, yes, people write poems when they're in love, but a wise man will not print them. A lieutenant in love and poor, this is a triangle, or more properly speaking, the half of the broken die of fortune. The lieutenant felt this very keenly, and therefore leaned his head against the window frame and sighed deeply. "The poor watchman in the street," said he, "is far happier than I am. He knows not what I call poverty. He has a home, a wife and children, who weep at his sorrow and rejoice at his joy. Oh, how much happier I should be if I could change my being and position with him, and pass through life with his humble expectations and hopes. Yes, he is indeed happier than I am." At this moment the watchman again became a watchman, for having, through the goloshes of fortune, passed into the existence of the lieutenant, and found himself less contented than he expected, he had preferred his former condition, and wished himself again a watchman. "That was an ugly dream," said he, "but droll enough. It seemed to me as if I were the lieutenant up yonder, but there was no happiness for me. I missed my wife and the little ones, who are always ready to smother me with kisses." He sat down again and nodded, but he could not get the dream out of his thoughts, and he still had the goloshes on his feet. A falling star gleamed across the sky. "There goes one," cried he. "However, there are quite enough left. I should very much like to examine those a little nearer, especially the moon, for that could not slip away under one's hands. The student for whom my wife washes says that when we die we shall fly from one star to another. If that were true, it would be very delightful. But I don't believe it. I wish I could make a little spring up there now. I would willingly let my body lie here on the steps." There are certain things in the world which should be uttered very cautiously, doubly so when the speaker has on his feet the goloshes of fortune. Now we shall hear what happened to the watchman. Nearly everyone is acquainted with the great power of steam. We have proved it by the rapidity with which we can travel, both on a railroad or in a steamship, across the sea. But this speed is like the movements of the sloth, or the crawling march of the snail, when compared to the swiftness with which light travels. Light flies 19,000,000 times faster than the fleetest racehorse, and electricity is more rapid still. Death is an electric shock which we receive in our hearts, and on the wings of electricity the liberated soul flies away swiftly. The light from the sun travels to our earth 95 millions of miles in 8 minutes and a few seconds. But on the wings of electricity the mind requires only a second to accomplish the same distance. The space between the heavenly bodies is to thought no farther than the distance we may have to walk from one's friend's house to another in the same town, and yet this electric shock obliges us to use our bodies here below, unless, like the watchman, we have on the goloshes of fortune. In a very few seconds the watchman had travelled more than 200,000 miles to the moon, which is formed of a lighter material than our earth, and may be said to be as soft as new fallen snow. He found himself on one of the circular ranges of mountains which we see represented in Dr. Madler's large map of the moon. The interior had the appearance of a large hollow bowl shaped, with a depth about half a mile from the brim. Within this hollow stood a large town. We may form some idea of its appearance by pouring the white of an egg into a glass of water. The materials of which it was built seemed just as soft, and pictured forth cloudy turrets and sail-like terraces, quite transparent and floating in the thin air. Our earth hung over his head like a great dark red ball. Presently he discovered a number of beings which might certainly be called men, but were very different to ourselves. A more fantastical imagination than Herschel's must have discovered these. Had they been placed in groups and painted, it might have been said, "What beautiful foliage!" They had also a language of their own. No one could have expected the soul of the watchman to understand it, and yet he did understand it, for our souls have much greater capabilities than we are inclined to believe. Do we not, in our dreams, show a wonderful dramatic talent? Each of our acquaintances appear to us then in his own character, and with his own voice. No man could thus imitate them in his waking hours. How clearly, too, we are reminded of persons whom we have not seen for many years. They start up suddenly to the mind's eye, with all their peculiarities, as living realities. In fact, this memory of the soul is a fearful thing. Every sin, every sinful thought it can bring back, and we may well ask how we are to give account of every idle word that may have been whispered in the heart or uttered with the lips. The spirit of the watchman therefore understood very well the language of the inhabitants of the moon. They were disputing about our earth, and doubted whether it could be inhabited. The atmosphere, they asserted, must be too dense for any inhabitants of the moon to exist there. They maintained that the moon alone was inhabited, and was really the heavenly body in which the old world people lived. They likewise talked politics. But now we will descend to East Street, and see what happened to the watchman's body. He sat lifeless on the steps. His staff had fallen out of his hand, and his eyes stared at the moon, about which his honest soul was wandering. "What is it o'clock, watchman?" inquired a passenger, but there was no answer from the watchman. The man then pulled his nose gently, which caused him to lose his balance. The body fell forward, and lay at full length on the ground as one dead. All his comrades were very much frightened, for he seemed quite dead. Still they allowed him to remain after they had given notice of what had happened, and at dawn the body was carried to the hospital. We might imagine it to be no jesting matter if the soul of the man should chance to return to him, for most probably it would seek for the body in East Street without being able to find it. We might fancy the soul inquiring of the police, or at the address office, or among the missing parcels, and then at length finding it at the hospital. But we may comfort ourselves by the certainty that the soul, when acting upon its own impulses, is wiser than we are. It is the body that makes it stupid. As we have said, the watchman's body had been taken to the hospital, and here it was placed in a room to be washed. Naturally, the first thing done here was to take off the goloshes, upon which the soul was instantly obliged to return, and it took the direct road to the body at once, and in a few seconds the man's life returned to him. He declared, when he quite recovered himself, that this had been the most dreadful night he had ever passed. Not for £100 would he go through such feelings again. However, it was all over now. The same day he was allowed to leave, but the goloshes remained at the hospital. End of The Watchman's Adventures. Section 12 of Hans Christian Andersen's Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hans Christian Andersen's Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 1, 1835 to 1842, by Hans Christian Andersen. Translated by H.P. Paul. The Goloshes of Fortune, Part 2. The eventful moment, a most unusual journey. Every inhabitant of Copenhagen knows what the entrance to Frederick's Hospital is like. But as most probably a few of those who read this little tale may not reside in Copenhagen, we'll give a short description of it. The hospital is separated from the street by an iron railing in which the bars stand so wide apart that, it is said, some very slim patients have squeezed through and gone to pay little visits in the town. The most difficult part of the body to get through was the head, and in this case, as it often happens in the world, the small heads were the most fortunate. This will serve as sufficient introduction to our tale. One of the young volunteers, of whom, physically speaking, it might be said that he had a great head, was on guard that evening at the hospital. The rain was pouring down, yet in spite of these two obstacles he wanted to go out just for a quarter of an hour. It was not worth while, he thought, to make a confidant of the porter, as he could easily slip through the iron railings. There lay the goloshes, which the watchman had forgotten. It never occurred to him that these could be goloshes of fortune. They would be very serviceable to him in this rainy weather, so he drew them on. Now came the question whether he could squeeze through the railings. He certainly had never tried, so he stood looking at them. "I wish to goodness my head was through," said he, and instantly, though it was so thick and large, it slipped through quite easily. The goloshes answered that purpose very well, but his body had to follow, and this was impossible. "I am too fat," he said. "I thought my head would be the worst part, but I cannot get my body through, that's certain." And then he tried to pull his head back again, but without success. He could move his neck about easily enough, and that was all. His first feeling was one of anger, and then his spirits sank below zero. The goloshes of fortune had placed him in this terrible position, and unfortunately it never occurred to him to wish himself free. No, instead of wishing, he kept twisting about, yet he did not stir from the spot. The rain poured, and not a creature could be seen in the street. The porter's bell he was unable to reach, and however was he to get loose? He foresaw that he should have to stay there till morning, and then they must send for a smith to file away the iron bars, and that would be a work of time. All the charity children would just be going to school, and all the sailors who inhabited that quarter of the town would be there to see him standing in the pillory. What a crowd there would be! "Ha!" he cried, "the blood is rushing to my head, and I shall go mad. I believe I am crazy already. Oh, I wish I were free, then all these sensations would pass off." Well, this is just what he ought to have said at first. The moment he had expressed the thought, his head was free. He started back, quite bewildered with the fright which the goloshes of fortune had caused him. But we must not suppose it was all over. No, indeed, there was worse to come yet. The night passed, and the whole of the following day, but no one sent for the goloshes. In the evening, a declamatory performance was to take place at the amateur theatre in a distant street. The house was crowded. Among the audience was the young volunteer from the hospital, who seemed to have quite forgotten his adventures of the previous evening. He had on the goloshes. They had not been sent for, and as the streets were still very dirty, they were of great service to him. A new poem, entitled "My Aunt's Spectacles," was being recited. It described these spectacles as possessing a wonderful power. If anyone put them on in a large assembly, the people appeared like cards, and the future events of ensuing years could be easily foretold by them. The idea struck him that he should very much like to have such a pair of spectacles, for if used rightly they would perhaps enable him to see into the hearts of people, which he thought would be more interesting than to know what was going to happen next year. For future events would be sure to show themselves, but the hearts of people never. I can fancy what I should see in the whole row of ladies and gentlemen on the first seat, if I could only look into their hearts. That lady, I imagine, keeps a store for things of all descriptions. How my eyes would wander about in that collection! With many ladies I should no doubt find a large millinery establishment. There is another that is perhaps empty, and would be all the better for cleaning out. There may be some well stored with good articles. Ah, yes, he sighed, I know one in which everything is solid, but a servant is there already, and that is the only thing against it. I dare say from many I should hear the words, 'Please to walk in.' I only wish I could slip into the hearts like a little tiny thought." This was the word of command for the goloshes. The volunteer shrunk up altogether and commenced a most unusual journey through the hearts of the spectators in the first row. The first heart he entered was that of a lady, but he thought he must have got into one of the rooms of an orthopedic institution where plaster casts of deformed limbs were hanging on the walls, with this difference, that the casts in the institution are formed when the patient enters, but here they were formed and preserved after the good people had left. These were casts of the bodily and mental deformities of the lady's female friends, carefully preserved. Quickly he passed into another heart, which had the appearance of a spacious holy church, with the white dove of innocence fluttering over the altar. Gladly would he have fallen on his knees in such a sacred place, but he was carried on to another heart, still, however, listening to the tones of the organ, and feeling himself that he had become another and a better man. The next heart was also a sanctuary, which he felt almost unworthy to enter. It represented a mean garret, in which lay a sick mother, but the warm sunshine streamed through the window. Lovely roses bloomed in a little flower box on the roof. 2 bluebirds sang of childlike joys, and the sick mother prayed for a blessing on her daughter. Next he crept on his hands and knees through an overfilled butcher's shop. There was meat, nothing but meat, wherever he stepped. This was the heart of a rich, respectable man, whose name is doubtless in the directory. Then he entered the heart of this man's wife. It was an old, tumble-down pigeon-house. The husband's portrait served as a weathercock. It was connected with all the doors, which opened and shut just as the husband's decision turned. The next heart was a complete cabinet of mirrors, such as can be seen in the castle of Rosenberg, but these mirrors magnified in an astonishing degree. In the middle of the floor sat, like the Grand Lama, the insignificant eye of the owner, astonished at the contemplation of his own features. At his next visit he fancied he must have got into a narrow needle case full of sharp needles. "Oh," thought he, "this must be the heart of an old maid." But such was not the fact. It belonged to a young officer who wore several orders, and was said to be a man of intellect and heart. The poor volunteer came out of the last heart in the row quite bewildered. He could not collect his thoughts, and he imagined his foolish fancies had carried him away. "Good gracious," he sighed, "I must have a tendency to softening of the brain, and here it is so exceedingly hot that the blood is rushing to my head." And then suddenly recurred to him the strange event of the evening before, when his head had been fixed between the iron railings in front of the hospital. "That is the cause of it all," he exclaimed. "I must do something in time. A Russian bath would be a very good thing to begin with. I wish I were lying on one of the highest shelves." Sure enough, there he lay on an upper shelf of a vapor bath, still in his evening costume, with his boots and goloshes on, and the hot drops from the ceiling falling on his face. "Ho!" he cried, jumping down and rushing toward the plunging bath. The attendant stopped him with a loud cry when he saw a man with all his clothes on. The volunteer had, however, presence of mind enough to whisper, "It is for a wager." But the first thing he did when he reached his own room was to put a large blister on his neck and another on his back, that his crazy fit might be cured. The next morning his back was very sore, which was all he gained by the goloshes of fortune. Next, the clerk's transformation. The watchman, whom we of course have not forgotten, thought after a while of the goloshes which he had found and taken to the hospital, so he went and fetched them. But neither the lieutenant nor any one in the street could recognize them as their own, so he gave them up to the police. "Why, they look exactly like my own goloshes," said one of the clerks, examining the unknown articles as they stood by the side of his own. It would require even more than the eye of a shoemaker to know one pair from the other. "Master Clerk," said a servant, who entered with some papers. The clerk turned and spoke to the man, but when he was done with him, he turned to look at the goloshes again, and now he was in greater doubt than ever as to whether the pair on the right or on the left belonged to him. "Those that are wet must be mine," thought he. But he thought wrong. It was just the reverse. The goloshes of fortune were the wet pair, and besides, why should not a clerk in a police office be wrong sometimes? So he drew them on, thrust his papers into his pockets, placed a few manuscripts under his arm, which he had to take with him and to make abstracts from at home. Then, as it was Sunday morning, and the weather very fine, he said to himself, "A walk to Fredericksburg will do me good." So away he went. There could not be a quieter or more steady young man than this clerk. We will not grudge him this little walk, and it was just the thing to do him good after sitting so much. He went on at first like a mere automaton, without thought or wish. Therefore the goloshes had no opportunity to display their magic power. In the avenue he met with an acquaintance, one of our young poets, who told him that he intended to start on the following day on a summer excursion. "Are you really going away so soon?" asked the clerk. "What a free, happy man you are! You can roam about where you will, while such as we are tied by the foot." "But it is fastened to the bread tree," replied the poet. "You need have no anxiety for the morrow, and when you are old there is a pension for you." "Ah, yes, but you have the best of it," said the clerk. "It must be so delightful to sit and write poetry. The whole world makes itself agreeable to you, and then you are your own master. You should try how you would like to listen to all the trivial things in a court of justice." The poet shook his head. So also did the clerk. Each retained his own opinion, and so they parted. "They are strange people, these poets," thought the clerk. "I should like to try what it is to have a poetic taste, and to become a poet myself. I am sure I should not write such mournful verses as they do. This is a splendid spring day for a poet. The air is so remarkably clear, the clouds are so beautiful, and the green grass has such a sweet smell. For many years I have not felt as I do at this moment." Now we perceive by these remarks that he had already become a poet. By most poets what he had said would be considered commonplace, or, as the Germans call it, insipid. It is a foolish fancy to look upon poets as different to other men. There are many who are more the poets of nature than those who are professed poets. The difference is this: the poet's intellectual memory is better. He seizes upon an idea or a sentiment until he can embody it clearly and plainly in words, which the others cannot do. But the transition from a character of everyday life to one of a more gifted nature is a great transition, and so the clerk became aware of the change after a time. "What a delightful perfume!" said he. "It reminds me of the violets at Aunt Laura's. Ah, that was when I was a little boy. Dear me, how long it seems since I thought of those days! She was a good old maiden lady. She lived yonder behind the Exchange. She always had a sprig or a few blossoms in water, let the winter be ever so severe. I could smell the violets, even while I was placing warm penny pieces against the frozen panes to make peepholes, and a pretty view it was on which I peeped. Out in the river lay the ships, ice-bound and forsaken by their crews. A screaming crow represented the only living creature on board. But when the breezes of spring came, everything started into life. Amidst shouting and cheers, the ships were tarred and rigged, and then they sailed to foreign lands. I remain here, and always shall remain, sitting at my post at the police office, and letting others take passports to distant lands. Yes, this is my fate." And he sighed deeply. Suddenly he paused. "Good gracious, what has come over me? I never felt before as I do now. It must be the air of spring. It is overpowering, and yet it is delightful." He felt in his pockets for some of his papers. "These will give me something else to think of," said he. Casting his eyes on the first page of one, he read, "Mistress Sigbirth, an original tragedy in 5 acts." "What is this? In my own handwriting, too! Have I written this tragedy?" He read again, "The Intrigue on the Promenade, or the Fast Day, a vaudeville." However did I get all this? Some one must have put them into my pocket. And here is a letter. It was from the manager of a theatre. The pieces were rejected, not at all in polite terms. "Hum, said he, sitting down on a bench. His thoughts were very elastic, and his heart softened strangely. Involuntarily he seized one of the nearest flowers. It was a little simple daisy. All that botanists can say in many lectures was explained in a moment by this little flower. It spoke of the glory of its birth. It told of the strength of the sunlight, which had caused its delicate leaves to expand and given to it such sweet perfume. The struggles of life, which arouse sensations in the bosom, have their type in the tiny flowers. Air and light are the lovers of the flowers, but light is the favored one. Towards light it turns, and only when light vanishes does it fold its leaves together and sleep in the embraces of the air. "It is light that adorns me," said the flower. "But the air gives you the breath of life," whispered the poet. Just by him stood a boy, splashing with his stick in a marshy ditch. The water drops spurted up among the green twigs, and the clerk thought of the millions of animalculae which were thrown into the air with every drop of water, at a height which must be the same to them as it would be to us if we were hurled beyond the clouds. As the clerk thought of all these things, and became conscious of the great change in his own feelings, he smiled and said to himself, "I must be asleep and dreaming. And yet, if so, how wonderful for a dream to be so natural and real, and to know at the same time, too, that it is but a dream. I hope I shall be able to remember it all when I wake to-morrow. My sensations seem most unaccountable. I have a clear perception of everything as if I were wide awake. I am quite sure if I recollect all this to-morrow, it will appear utterly ridiculous and absurd. I have had this happen to me before. It's with the clever or wonderful things we say or hear in dreams, as with the gold which comes from under the earth. It is rich and beautiful when we possess it, but when seen in its true light, it is but as stones and withered leaves." "Ah," he sighed mournfully, as he gazed at the birds singing merrily, or hopping from branch to branch, "they are much better off than I. Flying is a glorious power. Happy is he who is born with wings. Yes, if I could change myself into anything, I would be a little lark." At the same moment his coat tails and sleeves grew together and formed wings. His clothes changed to feathers, and his goloshes to claws. He felt what was taking place, and laughed to himself. "Well, now, it is evident I must be dreaming, but I never had such a wild dream as this." And then he flew up into the green boughs and sang. But there was no poetry in the song, for his poetic nature had left him. The goloshes, like all persons who wish to do a thing thoroughly, could only attend to one thing at a time. He wished to be a poet, and he became one. Then he wanted to be a little bird, and in this change he lost the characteristics of the former one. "Well," thought he, "this is charming. By day I sit in a police office amongst the driest law papers, and at night I can dream that I am a lark, flying about in the gardens of Fredericksburg. Really, a complete comedy could be written about it." And then he flew down into the grass, turned his head about in every direction, and tapped his beak on the bending blades of grass, which, in proportion to his size, seemed to him as long as the palm leaves in northern Africa. In another moment all was darkness around him. It seemed as if something immense had been thrown over him. A sailor boy had flung his large cap over the bird, and a hand came underneath and caught the clerk by the back and wings so roughly that he squeaked and then cried out in his alarm, "You impudent rascal, I am a clerk in the police office." But it only sounded to the boy like tweet, tweet, so he tapped the bird on the beak and walked away with him. In the avenue he met two schoolboys who appeared to belong to a better class of society, but whose inferior abilities kept them in the lowest class at school. These boys bought the bird for 8d., and so the clerk returned to Copenhagen. "It is well for me that I am dreaming," he thought, "otherwise I should become really angry. First I was a poet, and now I am a lark. It must have been the poetic nature that changed me into this little creature. It is a miserable story indeed, especially now I have fallen into the hands of boys. I wonder what will be the end of it." The boys carried him into a very elegant room, where a stout, pleasant-looking lady received them, but she was not at all gratified to find that they had brought a lark, a common field bird, as she called it. However, she allowed them for one day to place the bird in an empty cage that hung near the window. "It will please Polly, perhaps," she said, laughing at a large gray parrot who was swinging himself proudly on a ring in a handsome brass cage. "It is Polly's birthday," she added in simpering tone, "and the little field bird has come to offer his congratulations." Polly did not answer a single word. He continued to swing proudly to and fro, but a beautiful canary, who had been brought from his own warm, fragrant fatherland the summer previous, began to sing as loud as he could. "You screamer!" said the lady, throwing a white handkerchief over the cage. "Tweet, tweet," sighed he. "What a dreadful snowstorm!" And then he became silent. The clerk, or as the lady called him, the field bird, was placed in a little cage close to the canary, and not far from the parrot. The only human speech which Polly could utter, and which she sometimes chattered forth most comically, was, "Now let us be men." All besides was a scream quite as unintelligible as the warbling of the canary bird, excepting to the clerk, who, being now a bird, could understand his comrades very well. "I flew beneath green palm trees, and amidst the blooming almond trees," sang the canary. "I flew with my brothers and sisters over beautiful flowers, and across the clear bright sea, which reflected the waving foliage in its glittering depths, and I have seen many gay parrots who could relate long and delightful stories." "They were wild birds," answered the parrot, "and totally uneducated. Now let us be men. Why do you not laugh? If the lady and her visitors can laugh at this, surely you can. It is a great failing not to be able to appreciate what is amusing. Now let us be men." "Do you remember," said the canary, "the pretty maidens who used to dance in the tents that were spread out beneath the sweet blossoms? Do you remember the delicious fruit and the cooling juice from the wild herbs?" "Oh, yes," said the parrot, "but here I am much better off. I am well fed and treated politely. I know that I have a clever head, and what more do I want? Let us be men now. You have a soul for poetry. I have deep knowledge and wit. You have genius, but no discretion. You raise your naturally high notes so much that you get covered over. They never serve me so. Oh, no, I cost them something more than you. I keep them in order with my beak, and fling my wit about me. Now let us be men." "O my warm, blooming fatherland," sang the canary bird, "I will sing of thy dark green trees and thy quiet streams, where the bending branches kiss the clear, smooth water. I will sing of the joy of my brothers and sisters as their shining plumage flits among the dark leaves of the plants which grow wild by the springs." "Do leave off those dismal strains," said the parrot. "Sing something to make us laugh. Laughter is the sign of the highest order of intellect. Can a dog or a horse laugh? No. They can cry, but to man alone is the power of laughter given." "Ha, ha, ha!" laughed Polly, and repeated his witty saying, "Now let us be men." "You, little gray Danish bird," said the canary, "you also have become a prisoner. It is certainly cold in your forests, but still there is liberty there. Fly out. They have forgotten to close the cage, and the window is open at the top. Fly, fly!" Instinctively the clerk obeyed, and left the cage. At the same moment the half-open door leading into the next room creaked on its hinges, and stealthily, with green fiery eyes, the cat crept in and chased the lark round the room. The canary bird fluttered in his cage, and the parrot flapped his wings and cried, "Let us be men!" The poor clerk, in the most deadly terror, flew through the window, over the houses, and through the streets, till at length he was obliged to seek a resting place. A house opposite to him had a look of home. A window stood open. He flew in, and perched upon the table. It was his own room. "Let us be men now," said he, involuntarily imitating the parrot, and at the same moment he became a clerk again, only that he was sitting on the table. "Heaven preserve us!" said he. "How did I get up here and fall asleep in this way? It was an uneasy dream, too, that I had. The whole affair appears most absurd." Next, the best thing the goloshes did. Early on the following morning, while the clerk was still in bed, his neighbor, a young divinity student who lodged on the same story, knocked at his door and then walked in. "Lend me your goloshes," said he. "It is so wet in the garden, but the sun is shining brightly. I should like to go out there and smoke my pipe." He put on the goloshes, and was soon in the garden, which contained only one plum tree and one apple tree. Yet in a town, even a small garden like this is a great advantage. The student wandered up and down the path. It was just 6 o'clock, and he could hear the sound of the post horn in the street. "Oh, to travel, to travel!" cried he. "There is no greater happiness in the world. It is the height of my ambition. This restless feeling would be stilled if I could take a journey far away from this country. I should like to see beautiful Switzerland, to travel through Italy." And it was well for him that the goloshes acted immediately, otherwise he might have carried too far for himself as well as for us. In a moment he found himself in Switzerland, closely packed with 8 others in the diligence. His head ached, his back was stiff, and the blood had ceased to circulate, so that his feet were swelled and pinched by his boots. He wavered in a condition between sleeping and waking. In his right-hand pocket he had a letter of credit. In his left-hand pocket was his passport, and a few louis d'ors were sewn into a little leather bag which he carried in his breast pocket. Whenever he dozed, he dreamed that he had lost one or another of these possessions. Then he would awake with a start, and the first movements of his hand formed a triangle from his right-hand pocket to his breast, and from his breast to his left-hand pocket, to feel whether they were all safe. Umbrellas, sticks, and hats swung in the net before him, and almost obstructed the prospect, which was really very imposing, and as he glanced at it, his memory recalled the words of one poet at least, who has sung of Switzerland, and whose poems have not yet been printed. "How lovely to my wondering eyes Mont Blanc's fair summits gently rise! 'Tis sweet to breathe the mountain air, if you have gold enough to spare." Grand, dark, and gloomy appeared the landscape around him. The pine forests looked like little groups of moss on high rocks, whose summits were lost in clouds of mist. Presently it began to snow, and the wind blew keen and cold. "Ah," he sighed, "if I were only on the other side of the Alps now, it would be summer, and I should be able to get money on my letter of credit. The anxiety I feel on this matter prevents me from enjoying myself in Switzerland. Oh, I wish I was on the other side of the Alps." And there, in a moment, he found himself far away in the midst of Italy, between Florence and Rome, where the lake Thrasmene glittered in the evening sunlight like a sheet of molten gold between the dark blue mountains. There, where Hannibal defeated Flaminius, the grapevines clung to each other with the friendly grasp of their green tendril fingers, while by the wayside lovely half-naked children were watching a herd of coal-black swine under the blossoms of fragrant laurel. Could we rightly describe this picturesque scene, our readers would exclaim, "Delightful Italy!" But neither the student nor either of his travelling companions felt the least inclination to think of it in this way. Poisonous flies and gnats flew into the coach by thousands. In vain they drove them away with a myrtle branch. The flies stung them notwithstanding. There was not a man in the coach whose face was not swollen and disfigured with the stings. The poor horses looked wretched. The flies settled on their back in swarms, and they were only relieved when the coachman got down and drove the creatures off. As the sun set, an icy coldness filled all nature, not however of long duration. It produced the feeling which we experience when we enter a vault at a funeral on a summer's day, while the hills and the clouds put on that singular green hue which we often notice in old paintings and look upon as unnatural until we have ourselves seen nature's colouring in the south. It was a glorious spectacle, but the stomachs of the travellers were empty. Their bodies were exhausted with fatigue, and all the longings of their heart turned toward a resting place for the night. But where to find one they knew not. All the eyes were too eagerly seeking for this resting place to notice the beauties of nature. The road passed through a grove of olive trees. It reminded the student of the willow trees at home. Here stood a lonely inn, and close by it a number of crippled beggars had placed themselves. The brightest among them looked, to quote the words of Marryat, like the eldest son of famine who had just come of age. The others were either blind or had withered legs, which obliged them to creep about on their hands and knees, or they had shrivelled arms and hands without fingers. It was indeed poverty arrayed in rags. "Excellenza miserabili!" they exclaimed, stretching forth their diseased limbs. The hostess received the travellers with bare feet, untidy hair, and a dirty blouse. The doors were fastened together with string. The floors of the room were of brick, broken in many places. Bats flew about under the roof, and as to the odour within— "Let us have supper laid in the stable," said one of the travellers. "Then we shall know what we are breathing." The windows were opened to let in a little fresh air, but quicker than air came in the withered arms and the continual whining sounds of "Miserabili, Excellenza." On the walls were inscriptions, half of them against La Bella Italia. The supper made its appearance at last. It consisted of watery soup, seasoned with pepper and rancid oil. This last delicacy played a principal part in the salad. Musty eggs and roasted coxcombs were the best dishes on the table. Even the wine had a strange taste. It was certainly a mixture. At night all the boxes were placed against the doors, and one of the travellers watched while the others slept. The student's turn came to watch. How close the air felt in that room! The heat overpowered him. The gnats were buzzing about and stinging, while the miserabili outside moaned in their dreams. "Travelling would be all very well," said the student of divinity to himself, "if we had no bodies, or if the body could rest while the soul is flying. Wherever I go, I feel a want which oppresses my heart, for something better presents itself at the moment. Yes, something better. Which shall be the best of all? But where is that to be found? In fact, I know in my heart very well what I want. I wish to attain the greatest of all happiness." No sooner were the words spoken than he was at home. Long white curtains shaded the windows of his room, and in the middle of the floor stood a black coffin, in which he now lay in the still sleep of death. His wish was fulfilled. His body was at rest, and his spirit travelling. "Esteem no man happy until he is in his grave," were the words of Solon. Here was a strong, fresh proof of their truth. Every corpse is a sphinx of immortality. The sphinx in this sarcophagus might unveil its own mystery in the words which the living had himself written 2 days before: "Stern death, thy chilling silence waketh dread, yet in thy darkest hour there may be light. Earth's garden reaper from the grave's cold bed The soul on Jacob's ladder takes her flight. Man's greatest sorrows often are a part of hidden griefs, concealed from human eyes, which press far heavier on the lonely heart than now the earth that on his coffin lies. Two figures were moving about the room. We know them both. One was the fairy named Care, the other the messenger of Fortune. They bent over the dead. "Look," said Care, "what happiness have your goloshes brought to mankind?" "They have at least brought lasting happiness to him who slumbers here," she said. "Not so," said Care. "He went away of himself. He was not summoned. His mental powers were not strong enough to discern the treasures which he had been destined to discover. I will do him a favour now." And she drew the goloshes from his feet. The sleep of death was ended, and the recovered man raised himself. Care vanished, and with her the goloshes. Doubtless she looked upon them as her own property. End of section 12.
Section 13 of Hans Christian Andersen, Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ginger Kukalo. Hans Christian Andersen, Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 1, 1835 to 1842, by Hans Christian Andersen. Translated by H.P. Paul. The Daisy. Now listen. In the country, close by the high road, stood a farmhouse. Perhaps you have passed by and seen it yourself. There was a little flower garden with painted wooden palings in front of it. Close by was a ditch. On its fresh green bank grew a little daisy. The sun shone as warmly and brightly upon it as on the magnificent garden flowers, and therefore it thrived well. One morning it had quite opened, and its little snow-white petals stood around the yellow center, like the rays of the sun. It did not mind that nobody saw it in the grass, and that it was a poor, despised flower. On the contrary, it was quite happy, and turned towards the sun, looking upward and listening to the songs of the lark high up in the air. The little daisy was as happy as if the day had been a great holiday, but it was only Monday. All the children were at school, and while they were sitting on the forms and learning their lessons, it sat on its thin green stalk and learnt from the sun and from its surroundings how kind God is, and it rejoiced that the song of the little lark expressed so sweetly and distinctly its own feelings. With a sort of reverence, the daisy looked up to the bird that could fly and sing, but it did not feel envious. "I can see and hear," it thought. "The sun shines upon me, and the forest kisses me. How rich I am!" In the garden close by grew many large and magnificent flowers, and, strange to say, the less fragrance they had, the haughtier and prouder they were. The peonies puffed themselves up in order to be larger than the roses, but size is not everything. The tulips had the finest colors, and they knew it well, too, for they were standing bolt upright like candles, that one might see them the better. In their bright they did not see the little daisy, which looked over to them and thought, "How rich and beautiful they are! I am sure the pretty bird will fly down and call upon them. Thank God that I stand so near and can at least see all the splendor." And while the daisy was still thinking, the lark came flying down, crying, "Tweet!" But not to the peonies and tulips. No, into the grass, to the poor daisy. Its joy was so great that it did not know what to think. The little bird hopped round it and sang, "How beautifully soft the grass is, and what a lovely little flower with its golden heart and silver dress is growing here." The yellow center in the daisy did indeed look like gold, while the petals shone as brightly as silver. How happy the daisy was! No one has the least idea. The bird kissed it with its beak, sang to it, and then rose again up to the blue sky. It was certainly more than a quarter of an hour before the daisy recovered its senses. Half ashamed, yet glad at heart, it looked over to the other flowers in the garden. Surely they had witnessed its pleasure and the honor that had been done to it. They understood its joy. But the tulips stood more stiffly than ever. Their faces were pointed and red, because they were vexed. The peonies were sulky. It was well that they could not speak, otherwise they would have given the daisy a good lecture. The little flower could very well see that they were ill at ease, and pitied them sincerely. Shortly after this a girl came into the garden with a large sharp knife. She went to the tulips and began cutting them off, one after another. "Ugh!" sighed the daisy. "That is terrible. Now they are done for." The girl carried the tulips away. The daisy was glad that it was outside and only a small flower. It felt very grateful. At sunset it folded its petals and fell asleep, and dreamt all night of the sun and the little bird. On the following morning, when the flower once more stretched forth its tender petals, like little arms, towards the air and light, the daisy recognized the bird's voice, but what it sang sounded so sad. Indeed, the poor bird had good reason to be sad, for it had been caught and put into a cage close by the open window. It sang of the happy days when it could merrily fly about, of fresh green corn in the fields, and of the time when it could soar almost up to the clouds. The poor lark was most unhappy as a prisoner in a cage. The little daisy would have liked so much to help it, but what could be done? Indeed, that was very difficult for such a small flower to find out. It entirely forgot how beautiful everything around it was, how warmly the sun was shining, and how splendidly white its own petals were. It could only think of the poor captive bird, for which it could do nothing. Then 2 little boys came out of the garden. One of them had a large sharp knife, like that with which the girl had cut the tulips. They came straight towards the little daisy, which could not understand what they wanted. "Here is a fine piece of turf for the lark," said one of the boys, and began to cut out a square round the daisy, so that it remained in the center of the grass. "Pluck the flower off," said the other boy, and the daisy trembled for fear, for to be pulled off meant death to it, and it wished so much to live as it was to go with the square of turf until the poor captive lark's cage. "No, let it stay," said the other boy. "It looks so pretty." And so it stayed, and was brought into the lark's cage. The poor bird was lamenting its lost liberty, and beating its wings against the wires, and the little daisy could not speak or utter a consoling word, much as it would have liked to do so. So the forenoon passed. "I have no water," said the captive lark. "They have all gone out and forgotten to give me anything to drink. My throat is dry and burning. I feel as if I had fire and ice within me, and the air is so oppressive. Alas! I must die, and part with the warm sunshine, the fresh green meadows, and all the beauty that God has created." And it thrust its beak into the piece of grass to refresh itself a little. Then it noticed the little daisy, and nodded to it, and kissed it with its beak, and said, "You must also fade in here, poor little flower. You and the piece of grass are all they have given me in exchange for the whole world, which I enjoyed outside. Each little blade of grass shall be a green tree for me, each of your white petals a fragrant flower. Alas! You only remind me of what I have lost." "I wish I could console the poor lark," thought the daisy. It could not move one of its leaves, but the fragrance of its delicate petals streamed forth, and was much stronger than such flowers usually have. The bird noticed it, although it was dying with thirst, and its pain tore up the green blades of grass, but did not touch the flower. The evening came, and nobody appeared to bring the poor bird a drop of water. It opened its beautiful wings, and fluttered about in its anguish. A faint and mournful tweet, tweet, was all it could utter. Then it bent its little head towards the flower, and its heart broke for want and longing. The flower could not, as on the previous evening, fold up its petals in sleep. It dropped sorrowfully. The boys only came the next morning. When they saw the dead bird, they began to cry bitterly, dug a nice grave for it, and adorned it with flowers. The bird's body was placed in a pretty red box. They wished to bury it with royal honors. While it was alive and sang, they forgot it, and let it suffer want in the cage. Now they cried over it and covered it with flowers. The piece of turf, with the little daisy in it, was thrown out on the dusty highway. Nobody thought of the flower which had felt so much for the bird, and had so greatly desired to comfort it. End of The Daisy. Recording by Ginger Kukalo.
Section 14 of Hans Christian Andersen, Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hans Christian Andersen, Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 1, 1835 to 1842, by Hans Christian Andersen. Translated by H. P. Paul. The Brave Tin Soldier. There were once 25 tin soldiers, who were all brothers, for they had been made out of the same old tin spoon. They shouldered arms and looked straight before them, and wore a splendid uniform, red and blue. The first thing in the world they ever heard were the words, "Tin soldiers," uttered by a little boy, who clapped his hands with delight when the lid of the box in which they lay was taken off. They were given him for a birthday present, and he stood at the table to set them up. The soldiers were all exactly alike, excepting one, who had only one leg. He had been left to the last, and then there was not enough of the melted tin to finish him, so they made him stand firmly on one leg, and this caused him to be very remarkable. The table on which the tin soldiers stood was covered with other playthings, but the most attractive to the eye was a pretty little paper castle. Through the small windows the rooms could be seen. In front of the castle a number of little trees surrounded a piece of looking-glass, which was intended to represent a transparent lake. Swans made of wax swam on the lake, and were reflected in it. All this was very pretty, but the prettiest of all was a tiny little lady who stood at the open door of the castle. She also was made of paper, and she wore a dress of clear muslin, with a narrow blue ribbon over her shoulders, just like a scarf. In front of these was fixed a glittering tinsel rose, as large as her whole face. The little lady was a dancer, and she stretched out both her arms, and raised one of her legs so high that the tin soldier could not see it at all, and he thought that she, like himself, had only one leg. "That is the wife for me," he thought. "But she is too grand, and lives in a castle, while I have only a box to live in. 25 of us altogether. That's no place for her. Still, I must try and make her acquaintance." Then he laid himself at full length on the table, behind a snuff-box that stood upon it, so that he could peep at the little delicate lady, who continued to stand on one leg without losing her balance. When evening came, the other tin soldiers were all placed in the box, and the people of the house went to bed. Then the playthings began to have their own games together, to pay visits, to have sham fights, and to give balls. The tin soldiers rattled in their box. They wanted to get out and join the amusements, but they could not open the lid. The nutcrackers played at leap-frog, and the pencil jumped about the table. There was such a noise that the canary woke up and began to talk, and in poetry too. Only the tin soldier and the dancer remained in their places. She stood on tiptoe, with her legs stretched out, as firmly as he did on his one leg. He never took his eyes from her for even a moment. The clock struck 12, and with a bounce up sprang the lid of the snuff-box. But instead of snuff there jumped up a little black goblin, for the snuff-box was a toy puzzle. "Tin soldier," said the goblin, "don't wish for what does not belong to you." But the tin soldier pretended not to hear. "Very well, wait until to-morrow then," said the goblin. When the children came in the next morning, they placed the tin soldier in the window. Now whether it was the goblin who did it, or the draught, is not known, but the window flew open, and out fell the tin soldier, heels over head, from the 3rd story into the street beneath. It was a terrible fall, for he came head downwards, his helmet and his bayonet stuck in between the flagstones, and his one leg up in the air. The servant maid and the little boy went downstairs directly to look for him, but he was nowhere to be seen, although once they nearly trod upon him. If he had called out, "Here I am," it would have been all right, but he was too proud to cry out for help while he wore a uniform. Presently it began to rain, and the drops fell faster and faster, till there was a heavy shower. When it was over, 2 boys happened to pass by, and one of them said, "Look, here is a tin soldier. He ought to have a boat to sail in." So they made a boat out of newspaper, and placed the tin soldier in it, and sent him sailing down the gutter, while the two boys ran by the side of it and clapped their hands. Good gracious, what large waves rose in that gutter, and how fast the stream rolled on, for the rain had been very heavy. The paper boat rocked up and down, and turned itself round sometimes so quickly that the tin soldier trembled, yet he remained firm. His countenance did not change. He looked straight before him, and shouldered his musket. Suddenly the boat shot under a bridge which formed a part of a drain, and then it was as dark as the tin soldier's box. "Where am I going now?" thought he. "This is the black goblin's fault, I am sure. Ah, well, if the little lady were only here with me in the boat, I should not care for any darkness." Suddenly there appeared a great water rat who lived in the drain. "Have you a passport?" asked the rat. "Give it to me at once." But the tin soldier remained silent, and held his musket tighter than ever. The boat sailed on, and the rat followed it. How he did gnash his teeth, and cry out to the bits of wood and straw, "Stop him! Stop him! He has not paid toll, and he has not shown his pass." But the stream rushed on stronger and stronger. The tin soldier could already see daylight shining where the arch ended. Then he heard a roaring sound quite terrible enough to frighten the bravest man. At the end of the tunnel the drain fell into a large canal over a steep place, which made it as dangerous for him as a waterfall would be to us. He was too close to it to stop, so the boat rushed on, and the poor soldier could only hold himself as stiffly as possible, without moving an eyelid, to show that he was not afraid. The boat whirled round 3 or 4 times, and then filled with water to the very edge. Nothing could save it from sinking. He now stood up to his neck in water, while deeper and deeper sank the boat, and the paper became soft and loose with the wet, till at last the water closed over the soldier's head. He thought of the elegant little dancer whom he should never see again, and the words of the song sounded in his ear: "Farewell, warrior, ever brave, drifting onward to thy grave." Then the paper boat fell to pieces, and the soldier sank into the water, and immediately afterwards was swallowed up by a great fish. Oh, how dark it was inside the fish! A great deal darker than in the tunnel, and narrower too. But the soldier continued firm, and lay at full length, shouldering his musket. The fish swam to and fro, making the most wonderful movements, but at last he became quite still. After a while a flash of lightning seemed to pass through him, and then the daylight approached, and a voice cried out, "I declare, here is the tin soldier!" The fish had been caught, taken to market, and sold to the cook, who took him into the kitchen and cut him open with a large knife. She picked up the soldier, and held him by the waist between her finger and thumb, and carried him into the room. They were all anxious to see this wonderful soldier who had travelled about inside a fish, but he was not at all proud. They placed him on the table, and how many curious things do happen in the world! There he was in the very same room from the window of which he had fallen. There were the same children, the same playthings standing on the table, and the pretty castle with the elegant little dancer at the door. She still balanced herself on one leg, and held up the other, so she was as firm as himself. It touched the tin soldier so much to see her that he almost wept tin tears, but he kept them back. He only looked at her, and they both remained silent. Presently one of the little boys took up the tin soldier and threw him into the stove. He had no reason for doing so, therefore it must have been the fault of the black goblin who lived in the snuff box. The flames lighted up the tin soldier as he stood. The heat was very terrible, but whether it proceeded from the real fire or from the fire of love he could not tell. Then he could see that the bright colours were faded from his uniform, but whether they had been washed off during his journey or from the effects of his sorrow, no one could say. He looked at the little lady, and she looked at him. He felt himself melting away, but he still remained firm, with his gun on his shoulder. Suddenly the door of the room flew open, and the draught of air caught up the little dancer. She fluttered like a sylph right into the stove by the side of the tin soldier, and was instantly in flames, and was gone. The tin soldier melted down into a lump, and the next morning, when the maid servant took the ashes out of the stove, she found him in the shape of a little tin heart. But of the little dancer nothing remained but the tinsel rose, which was burnt black as a cinder. End of The Brave Tin Soldier. Recording by Noel Badrian, County Offaly, Ireland.